Welcome to St. John's Cathedral. I'm Tina Clark, Director of Christian Formation, and I am here with the Reverend Glenn Sackett, who's a board certified chaplain and an expert on resilience. And if we don't need resilience right now, I can't imagine when we do. And this morning's tech failures are a great example of that need. So I'll just say a quick prayer and we will go ahead and record our conversation. The Lord be with you. Creator God, thank you for your presence here with us this morning, for our strength and our resilience in managing this very challenging time, not just technology. Be with us, be with those who are suffering, be with those who have lost a loved one. Guide us into the next stages. Be with us this Advent and Christmas season as we experience the incarnation in a new and hopefully very connective way. In the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for being with us and for your patience with us this morning as we solved problems.
I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. Katie Pearson introduced us after she had met you when she was going through seminary and doing her, I think, chaplaincy rotation. And she spoke so highly of you and wanted me to meet you. So we got to meet about a year ago and talk about resilience for our youth, for our families, for our entire parish. And then the pandemic hit. And I mean, what could we need more right now than to learn about resilience? So thank you so much for being here. And can you just give us a little introduction in terms of what got you into this work from being a chaplain? How did resilience come into play? And what also does cultivating resilience mean to you? That's a phrase that you use frequently. So tell us a little bit about what that means.
Well, I'd like to start by having you be aware of the resiliency with a Y that you already have. Look at your skin on your hand. This is your interface with the world. I invite anybody who's listening, watching to do this. Look at your hand, look maybe the back of your hand, put your other hand there and squeeze it and move it around and notice that your interface with the world in the third dimension is very flexible. Mm-hmm. It's also very distinct, but it's flexible, it's dynamic. It allows us to move and flow. It gives our body the ability to move in our space. And that is a demonstration of resilience. It is grounded in something very solid, our body, and yet it connects us with the whole world around us, and it allows us to adapt and move within our space. So the pebble-sized definition of resilience is our bounce back ability, our ability to be flexible in response to what happens in life around us. So we can think of that physically, like the skin on the back of our hands or any of our skin. It's just, you know, there are some people who just have rubber faces. and the way we interface with our world changes all kinds of things. We are energy beings. As human beings, we are energy processors. We take energy in, we put energy out. So it's not only, our skin is not only our interface with the world, but all of the energy that we take in and put out is part of our interface with our world. And it's flexible and dynamic, and we can shift it anytime we want to. So in reality, human beings are the most adaptable species on the planet. We can live anywhere on the planet. We can adapt ourselves and our housing and our clothing and our way of coming in and going out to any climate, anywhere. That's just one kind of demonstration of resilience. Now, resilience used to be, the word when I was in school was simply related to material science. It wasn't applied to human beings. So we think about things like the rubber band. This is a big rubber band. The definition of material resilience is a material that can be stretched or bent or twisted or manipulated in some way. And when the force acting on it is released, it will resume its former shape, its former dimension, its former characteristics. So we think of rubber bands and balloons and spring steel and a few other things. Willow trees, we often talk about how the willow bends in the wind rather than breaks. This is all about material science resilience. The first time I heard it used in reference to human beings was when my social worker colleague Judy Jones came to me one day. We worked together in a hospital mental health, behavioral health treatment setting. And she came to me one day and she says, Glenn, we've got to start teaching resilience to our clients. And she was specifically talking about the clients in a geriatric treatment program that we worked in together, along with the adult and the youth treatment programs that we had. And I said, tell me, what are you talking about? And as she began to describe it, she said, well, you know, we always used to think that bad kids came from bad homes. That was the assumption in youth behavioral health treatment. Now, I've been involved in youth behavioral health treatment since 1985. Behavioral health treatment in general since 1980, yeah. Is in those early years applied to people. But what she described to me suddenly lit things up for me, because she said, you know, we used to always study the kids in treatment and try to figure out what was wrong with them, what was going on in their lives, and try to fix it. But she said somebody asked this really interesting question one day. Why do we always study the kids who are in trouble at school, in trouble in the courts, in trouble in their neighborhood? Why don't we study the kids who aren't in trouble? In fact, these kids who we have in our treatments program, most of them have siblings at home who are not in trouble. Why don't we study them? And so they did. And very quickly, they came to realize that it wasn't just bad homes or bad situations at home or difficulties in the home or the neighborhood that got some kids off track. It was a different way that some people respond to challenge and difficulty than others do. And so they begin to describe the siblings at home that didn't need treatment as resilient kids. And that was where the word came into reference to human beings. Resilient kids. I like that term. And it's like John Gottman and some of our Denver University behavioral health people and researchers who did a parallel path with marriages. Marriages had always been studied in terms of what breaks down when marriages go bad. And Gottman out west and the folks here at Denver University said, what would happen if we studied the marriages that work? Do you think we could learn something? And sure enough, it turns out that there are some things that marriages that work have in common with each other. And there's a whole movement in social psychology and organizational development now called Appreciative Inquiry that's become the big umbrella term for this whole field of what would happen if we looked at what works. So we now understand that resilience, like our flexible skin and our adaptability as human beings in our environment, resiliency with a Y is something that we're all born with a certain amount of, and it's fixed. We show up in the world with a certain amount of adaptability, ability to respond appropriately and positively. So our bounce back ability is something that we're grounded with, that we come into the world with, but it's in a limited amount. Resilience with an E at the end of the word in research implies the second kind of total resilient capacity, that we're this, what we showed up in the world with, and now what we can learn by practicing certain ways of interfacing with the world. Resilience is something that can be developed, added to, expanded, and we can increase our ability to adapt appropriately to changes around us and to challenges around us. So the pebble size definition is bounce back ability. The stone size definition is our total resilient capacity is the sum of resiliency, which we were born with, and resilience, which is something that we can learn and cultivate by certain practices in our life. And I'll save the boulder definition, the boulder size definition, for later on.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So that was how I got involved, and quickly discovered that I knew lots more about it than I thought I did, because those of us who'd been working in treatment had made these observations. We hadn't used this language, however, to describe it.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you. You and I, when we talked, a couple of the phrases you brought up were toxic positivity and shallow optimism. Katie Pearson and I are in many ways very much alike, Ken and Katie here at the Cathedral. And since the beginning of this, she and I both, every time we find a silver lining type moment, a reason to find something positive about our current situation, she and I have practically turned Pollyanna into a verb that will say, well, I don't want to Pollyanna this, but here's, how this is a benefit, or here's a good side of this. So what is toxic positivity or shallow optimism, and how does that damage us instead of building resilience?
Toxic positivity doesn't recognize our entire reality. It puts blinders on so that we can only see. I saw a t-shirt recently, and this week I saw the bumper sticker that matches it. It says, "Positive vibes only." Now, I would actually have that bumper sticker on my car, but I would take the word "only" off. Mm-hmm. Because our capacity to attend to what's positive within the context of all, including the negative, including the difficult, including what challenges us, is important. Let me step back here and introduce you to my teaching assistant, Bozo, who I have facing the other direction, because I know there are some people who are not crazy about clowns.
I would be one of those people.
So we could call him a bop toy. That's what the generic term. I have a Cars model of this too. There's a demonstration here of the three primary characteristics of resilience that we need to understand. The first is the sandbag in the bottom here. The sandbag grounds our bop toy. It connects it to the earth in a particular way. And that's very important. And grounding really means that we are solidly connected where we stand or where we sit. So I would invite you at this very moment, just whether you're standing or sitting, to notice where the pressure of your connection to what's grounding you. If it's a chair, is there more pressure on one side than the other? Are you leaning forward? Are you leaning back? The pressure that you have, if you're standing like I am at the moment, right now I feel the pressure on one hip and one foot, the heel. But if I shift myself a little bit and I put the weight evenly on both feet, toes and heels both, I'm suddenly more grounded. I'm more stable. Someone would, my teaching partner, not Bozo, but my actual co-facilitator for many years, Dottie, at this point when I was talking to a group of nurses or something, she'd just reach over and push on my shoulder when I'm standing on one foot and see how quickly I stumble. But as soon as I stand or sit solidly centered, I'm now grounded. I'm connected with reality. So toxic positivity is not well grounded. It is missing our awareness of and the reality of what challenges us in life or at this very moment. Genuine positivity takes into account not only what's positive, not only the positive vibes, but also the forces that are acting on us to limit, to constrict, to divert, to detour in some way the flow of energy in the direction that we wanted it to go. So this grounding is really important, to be grounded in reality, not in a fantasy, not in wishful thinking. And this even extends intergenerationally, because if as a parent, I think that my job is to protect my children from all the challenges and the difficulties in the world, they're not going to be grounded in reality. They're going to be unable to deal with the actual challenges of life, because life is nothing more than a series of challenges which we get to overcome and in the process grow and learn. So grounding is really important. Toxic positivity is that statement of positive vibes only. It's that we will only allow what's good to come into awareness. That's not real. It's not a good place to stand. So second characteristic while we're here is that Bozo, or my bop toy, is inspired. I know that this one's inspired because I inspired right here. This has been sitting in my garage for a couple of months and had become half deflated. And so I had to open this up, inflate, inspire this bop toy again so that it holds its space in the world. Without that, there'd still be just a puddle of plastic here, even though well grounded. So this second characteristic that's really important to us is to be aware of all the ways in which energy comes into us, through our physical body, through our emotional body, through our mental body, our thought process, and through our spiritual body. What are the ways in which we are inspired, that we bring in energy, that we receive energy from the world? Not only good energy, but the energy that we don't like, because it all affects us. Okay? Third characteristic here is the boundary, which we already talked about in terms of the skin. If that boundary were glass, it would very easily be shattered, and it would be non-resilient. So the practices, and welcome all of you who have joined in the last few minutes here. I appreciate seeing people show up, knowing that we are in an enlarging group on a Sunday morning, and that together we get to explore this path of resilience. So for those of you who did join in the last few minutes, I want to make a distinction, because I'll use this language throughout the rest of our conversation. Resiliency with a Y is something we're all born with. We are adaptable as human beings, very adaptable, but we only have a limited amount of that. So in the research world, we use resiliency with a Y to describe that part of our capacity that came with us when we were born. The second kind of resilience is resilience with an E, and that's what we can learn and develop and cultivate by practices that we adopt, by strategies of thinking that we learn. AA is a great example, and Al-Anon and all of those anonymous organizations are good examples of groups who have learned how to process emotional and thought material and energy in a way that increases our resilience. So now your question was about...
it was about toxic positivity and shallow optimism.
Yeah.
And
so we want to make sure that we're grounded in reality, not in a wishful thinking kind of world.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in a conversation you and I had, I loved what you said. We were talking about grief in that moment, but I feel like this applies to grief, loss, anger, frustration, all of these so-called negative emotions. And you said that grief is like a 2-year-old. Can you just tell our folks why? And let me just pause for 1 second. Those of you who have joined us, thank you so much. Our webinar account went down this morning. We realized this at 8:45. So we're so glad you're here. We pivoted, and thanks to Evans Owsley and Christina Rutland for making this work, and to Glenn for his flexibility. We're so glad you're here. And if you have questions for Glenn as we go through our conversation today, please type them into the chat feature. If you joined us late and you'd like to see the beginning of this conversation, we did record from the beginning, so you'll be able to do that, and it will be on our YouTube channel. So thank you all for finding us. We appreciate it. So Glenn, tell us about how grief and negative feelings are like a 2-year-old.
Oh, thanks for bringing up grief. It's so important. And right now, this year, I think we all need to do a Blue Christmas. Because part of our experience this year is a kind of grief that most of us have not known before.
Yeah.
I call it the loss of the imagined future. It's been said that the most useless purchase of 2019 was a 2020 planner. You throw that out the window. whatever we thought was going to happen in 2020 was only a small shadow of what's actually happened. And so if we have gone through 2020 this far without increasing our resilience, I'd really be surprised. And if we haven't increased it already pretty significantly, we really need this conversation. Grief is one of the very significant challenges that life throws at us. And it's grief in the loss of a loved one through death. It's grief in health challenges that change our abilities or our mobility or some life circumstance, whether it's an injury, an accident, a disease, aging. There are all kinds of losses that we experience in life. And having resilience practices turn out to be one of the greatest sets of tools necessary to grieve and mourn appropriately. And so one of those is simply to recognize the greatest piece of wisdom that I've learned about grief. I learned from Larry Houston, who was a colleague, chaplain, as well as a thanatologist who studied with the best thanatologists in the world. And he's the one that helped me understand grief is like a 2-year-old. It just wants our attention. When 2-year-olds act out, usually they're at some kind of attention deficit, not a disorder. They're not getting the kind of attention that they need. I had a great friend who was also a ministry colleague and eventually a chaplain colleague named Doug. And he was Irish, his wife was Irish, and their son was curly, redhead Irish as could be. And he was a live wire. He could disrupt a whole room full of people in 5 seconds of coming in the door. And Cameron was my son Scott's best friend. And so we were with him a lot. And it was really magical to watch Doug with Cameron. Cameron would be in a house full of people, and pretty soon he'd be disrupting things. And he'd come into the room where we adults were and start acting out. And Doug would sit on the floor. You know, we might have been playing a game, sitting at a table. Doug would get up from the table. He would sit down on the floor and he'd reach out his arms and he'd say, "Cameron." And Cameron would turn and look at him and he'd come running to him and they'd just give each other a great big hug. And Doug never said anything to him about his behavior, nothing about how distracting what he was doing was or how inappropriate it might be. He just did this big hug thing. And by the way, in this 2020 year of no hugs, do we need that? Are we missing some attention that we're used to having?
Yeah.
So here's a practice right now. This is a great resilience practice and one that we need this year especially. How many times have you come into a place where there was someone else this year and you may have gone like, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you," and then drop the arms and go on with the conversation? That's not what would happen if we were being resilient about this. What would happen is that we would stop, we would reach out our arms and we would pause. If we were actually able to hug each other, we'd be like this and we would go, "Ah, it's so good to see you," and be with you. So our resilience practice for this year of no hugs is to not do this little fake hug thing, but to actually reach out toward each other without embracing and without being too close and without being without our masks, even with our masks here, but we're reaching out and we're pausing for a moment, and then we're taking a deep breath together and we're going like, all right, if you're not doing that, I invite you, I'm going to do it once more and give you time to do it with me. Let's do this here. I'm so glad to be with you this morning.
We are so glad to be with you. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Now, let me just ask what you experienced in that moment of taking the additional time and attention that it took to actually breathe together, embracing each other with an air guitar hug, if you want to use that language, if that helps. What happened differently?
It's that stopping and truly connecting with each other, instead of a transient sort of, we wish we were connecting, but we have to stay apart and keep moving. And it really does stop you, and your body fills with healthy oxygen and all of the good things that come with that. I've felt even in that just one moment.
Isn't that amazing?
It is.
How much different the energy that we experience is by that momentary, it only takes 10 seconds, but it's amazing what difference it makes. I'm going to go back to the definition, the question you asked about cultivating resilience, which is in our definition, not the pea size or the pebble size definition, but the rock size definition. Cultivating resilience means that we are creating, facilitating conditions for something to happen. If you're a gardener, you know that cultivating doesn't force things to grow. It's very necessary, it's essential. What cultivating does is it creates facilitating conditions for life to thrive. So if we think about what does it take for my life to thrive in a challenging world that's full of change, that constantly is giving and taking, what are the cultivating conditions, the facilitating conditions I need? How can I cultivate my personal garden so that I can thrive in my life within this whole context of the life dimensions that I have? So when we talk about cultivating, we're talking about doing something that sets up something else to happen that's lively. So that 10-second pause, taking a deep breath, actually embracing each other from a distance rather than just this pretend fake hug thing, as if we have to hurry through this. No, we don't have to hurry through this. We can actually take the time, the same amount of time that we would if we actually embraced each other physically. And if we
there's
do
one
that,
thing we have more of, it's time.
cultivated. We've created the possibility for a much richer energy exchange to happen between us.
Yeah.
So that's an example. And it's an example of cultivating resilience doesn't always mean these lifelong practices that we have to learn new habits. That's important, but it's not always. Sometimes it's what can I do in 10 seconds right now? Stand up straight, take a deep breath, reach out, embrace, say a prayer, count to 10, like grandma taught us to do. You know, there's all kinds of things like that it only takes 10 seconds to do, but that create entirely different facilitating conditions in which we grow and thrive. The bolder size definition of cultivating resilience says that resilience is our ability to resume a chosen course after life has provided an obstacle, a detour, a diversion, by manifesting positive adaptive responses. There's a nice acronym for this, PAR, P-A-R, positive adaptive responses. So we can ask ourselves when something happens, am I up to par on this? It's a really nice little question. Am I up to par? Positive adaptive responses. So what that reminds me is that when something difficult happens to us, something challenging, something surprising, our lizard brain is instantly on that and pulls a response out of our childhood adaptive responses. Probably whatever anxiety management tool worked best in our family of origin. For some people, that means going in my room and closing the door. It's called withdrawal. Okay. For some people, it's to fight. So we got fight or flight right there.
Right.
For other people in their home of origin, family of origin, the best way to deal with anxiety and confrontation and difficulty was to come out not physically fighting and occupying the space, but putting mental energy out there and getting into an argument about it.
Yes.
And so a rational, not just argumentativeness, but to actually rationalize, think our way through something. I heard somebody describe someone who's not resilient one day as this person couldn't think their way out of a paper bag, like a cat in a bag. And for other people, it's an emotionally leading response. And so of these 4 primary anxiety management strategies, most of us have one really well developed, and it's the one that worked best in our family of origin. But in adult life, we need all of them. But our lizard brain, our limbic system, will only pull up that first one, and it will push us into that activity. That's a reaction, not chosen action. So our ability to resume a chosen course after life has provided an obstacle, diversion, detour by manifesting positive adaptive responses. So this thing that our grandma taught us, or somebody in your family, count to 10 before you speak. Well, the reason for that is because our thoughtful brain, our prefrontal cortex, needs a little time to let what happened percolate down through the layers of our consciousness. And then it can choose whichever response fits the situation best, not the response that worked best on our family of origin. So whether it's taking a deep breath or counting to 10 or standing up straight, all of which help us physically, but they also allow the prefrontal cortex to get involved.
Right. Excellent. So
The higher self would be another way to talk about that.
We all need to access that more.
Yeah.
So I feel like you've kind of addressed my next question, but I did want to turn us very specifically. And we know that some families are less functional than others when it comes to what were our family responses when we were children. So for parents, for grandparents, godparents, aunts and uncles, for people who love children and have children in their lives, and we are watching our children, go through something that is unimaginable, or was unimaginable until it happened. And I've said to some people, I think that this has the potential to create one of the most resilient generations that we've seen in a long time. My kids are in high school and middle school, and
Yes.
this has, rocked their world and all of their peers. And my hope is that when we come out of this, they have grown in resilience and they'll have this sense of pride. I got through the pandemic and I finished 8th grade in the pandemic and all of those kinds of things. But I worry about kids who might fall through the cracks. I worry about families who don't have strong resilience practices. So what's your advice to families to help our children of various ages develop resilience practices? And you've mentioned some things. Is there anything else that you would have parents do with kids?
The most important is to listen to our kids.
Yes.
It's very natural for us to, there's an empathy trap here, actually. What we do, well, let me start with the best. The best thing to do is to listen and find out, what is the child's experience? What is my teenager's experience in this? How are they experiencing the changes? And let them tell us, because then we can respond to what's actually happening for them, not what our imagination tells us is happening. Because we're putting a layer of our own experience on top of what's happening to them. We're thinking about, oh, what would I have done when I was that age if this had happened to me? And we are regressing ourselves back to that age. And when we do that, we actually lose all of the adult capacities that we've learned. When we emotionally regress to a previous age, we lose our adult capabilities. And then we imagine our child with only those capabilities that we had at that age. They have a lot more than that because they've already learned from us. They've already begun to face their own challenges and they're beginning to adapt to those. So rather than layering our limitations on them and imagining how we would react, we need to listen to them to find out how they are. This has been fascinating to me because I have a bunch of friends around me. My grandchildren happen to live on the other side of the world, so I don't get to see this in my own family as much right now as I do in my friend community. These people that I sit down in the coffee shop with. Now, this week it's sitting outdoors on the sunny side of the building outdoors. Uh, and I listen to these parents talk about what their kids are going through and they're layering on their own limitations. And then I see their kids come in or I see them in the community and the kids are talking about this in a completely different way. The kids are looking for the cracks in the doors, the cracks in the walls, the cracks in the barriers. They're looking for, how do I get through this? And they're finding their way. And they're not experiencing, most children, most teenagers are not experiencing this pandemic year as negatively as we adults are.
Really?
They're more flexible, they're more dynamic, they're in the age in life where they're learning something every single day. And so they're used to that adaptation and adjustment. And back to the rubber band, let's not confuse material science with human adaptivity and resilience. So in material science, the object that's resilient always resumes its previous form. In human resilience, we want to be careful and have a distinction here because the language of the boulder-sized definition of resilience is that we resume a chosen course after these forces have acted on us. That's not necessarily going to be the same shape we were in before. In reality, most of the time when we adapt, we give a positive adaptive response. It's adaptive to the situation we're in right now. We end up being larger. We have expanded our capabilities. We have now stretched into a larger space. Well, our kids are doing that all the time. And so this is just their reality that they're responding to and learning from and learning in, just like everything else that happens in school and life. So listen, notice what their actual challenges are, not how we perceive them to be.
Right.
And then the third thing goes back to that conversation we had earlier about toxic positivity. And we sometimes use the term helicopter parenting or bulldozer or snowplow parenting, where we think that our job as older people is to push all the obstacles out of the way for our children so that they can move forward. That's actually not helpful. And I would remind us of perhaps the last time you saw a 1-year-old learning to walk. They've experienced the world on their belly and on their back and occasionally on their side and in transition, rolling from one side to the other. And then there's this amazing day that happens when they realize that they can stretch vertically and that they can get up on their feet holding on to things. And the next thing that happens is boom. Do they quit? Do they fail? No, because they don't quit. Failure is only when we quit trying. Again, they start pulling their way up, standing up, boom, boom. This is how we learn. This is how human beings are designed to learn, is by experimentation, by pushing against boundaries, by expanding the limited space around us. That's how we're best designed to learn. And so if we will, instead of trying to hold the child up all the time so they won't go boom, this is why practice is so important, because not only is the child learning the repetitive motion of standing up, but every time they do that, there are more synapses in the brain that are connecting with the information from the nerves and the muscles and the proprioception nerves that tell us where our body is in space. And all of those things are being wired with every stretch boom cycle. And so children learn by facing challenge, by meeting it part way and falling back and then going again at it. And each time that challenge is faced, engaged, encountered, and pushed against, more learning takes place. So I learned this from my wife, Donna, when she was working on her master's degree in early childhood development. She came home one day talking about this term that just lit me up, because they were learning that children learn best in an environment where they are given an optimal level of frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Not totally frustrated so that nothing can happen, like a child who's under a space which they can't stand up in. That would be more than optimal frustration. Not being held up so that they can't fall, because if we hold a child up when they're trying to learn to walk and we don't let them fall, their muscles and their synapses and their brain can't connect to all those bits of information necessary to create balance. So there's an optimal level of frustration, whether it's in physical learning, mental learning, emotional learning, spiritual learning, all of those dimensions of our life. We have to have some frustration to push through, to actually be able to allow all the mental connections to take place that increase our capacity in learning. Training wheels on a bicycle. We use training wheels to keep our kids from falling. They actually have to fall. They don't have to fall bad enough to hurt themselves. But they actually have to be out of balance to be able to develop balance. Yeah, so my parents didn't put training wheels on my bike. They put me on the grass so that I wouldn't get hurt when I fell. They didn't take me out to the street. So that's the third thing that we can do with our children in this year of requiring great adaptability is we can identify what are the real dangers and protect them from those. So like when my kids were teenagers, we had an agreement, Donna and I did with them. There were only 3 times that we would intervene and interfere with their learning process. If they were doing something actually dangerous that could have the risk of death or severe injury, we would say, wait. If something was illegal, which has long-term consequences, not just for the moment, but it gets on your record and messes the space in which you live up, it can reduce that. If something was actually dangerous, if it was illegal, or if it was immoral in our family's code of morality, we would certainly interfere in those decisions, and we would stop that decision process and try to help them learn and think better.
Yeah.
But we'd actually stop it if we had to.
Yeah.
Other than that, if Scott wanted to show up with blue hair at school one day, fine. It's not illegal. It's not immoral. It's not dangerous. There are consequences. There might be people who don't like him. There might be teachers who would ask, all those kinds. But it's a learning experience.
Right. Right.
So allowing them to learn, supporting them in the learning process. And I remember I used to go to camp meeting when I was a kid. And there was a camp store, and milk came in glass jars in those days. And I went to the store to get milk to bring back to our cabin. And halfway back to the cabin, something happened and my attention was diverted. And I dropped this glass of milk and it shattered on the asphalt and spilled the milk all over the place. And I went back to the cabin crying and apologetic. And my mom said, "Oh." And my dad said, "Don't cry over spilled milk." I'd heard that term before, but it never meant so much as it did that day. So they supported me in that moment and said, there's another bottle of milk at the store. Let's get that one.
Nice.
I actually heard of a mother who in that same situation said, "Oh, Johnny, it looks like you've been conducting an experiment of how to move milk in a glass container from one place to another, and you've learned one way not to do it. Now let's see if we can do that experiment again and see if you can find a way to do it successfully."
I love that.
I love it too, supporting the
Oh, Glenn, thank you so
learning that's
much.
necessary.
Absolutely. So we've got to let our kids struggle. We've got to let them face challenges so that they know how to
Right.
face challenges. I
While
can tell
protecting
you,
them from actual long-term serious
yeah,
consequences and while supporting their learning activity and helping them have more choices and better ways of thinking through those choices.
yes, absolutely. Glenn, I could keep talking to you all morning, but we are running out of time. And I did want, you have a practice that I think helps build your personal resilience. And I'm putting a link in the chat right now. Do you want to talk just very briefly before we have to sign off about your photography?
I love nature. My family was a nature-loving family, and at age 6, my mom put a Kodak Brownie camera in my hands and sent me out into the world. She also tried to teach me to paint, but I wasn't so good at that. But with a camera, I could compose things and frame them up and make them look interesting. And by the time I was 8 years old, my granddad, who was a painter and a photographer and a surgeon, and he was kind of Da Vinci in my living space, saw that I had some promise, and he took me into his dark room and showed me the magic of the craft of photography. And I was hooked. By the time he taught me to put numbers on my slides and to keep a notebook of what settings I used on the camera, so that when I got that little yellow Kodak box in the mail, I could go, look, oh, that one's really good. And then I could go back to my notebook and see, what did I do that made that so good? By the time I had 10,000 slides numbered, my friends and family were saying to me, Glenn, you should sell your photography. It's really good. And I had sold some, I'd had some published, but not much. And I asked myself, why have I not done this more? And fairly quickly came to the realization that for me, photography was a practice of meditation. It gave me that chance to breathe more deeply in nature. It slowed me down. Where other people were on the path getting up to the top of the mountain, I was looking for how to set this little alpine flower garden up in front of the mountain peak behind so that they were connected and showed the relationship. And then I would snap the picture.
Lovely.
So
I'm so sorry. We are just out of time. But I do encourage everyone. Glenn's photography is stunning and touching and poignant. And I did post the link, which it's easy to find glennsackett.com. So I encourage people to go take a look. Um, Holy Eucharist service will be online at 10 o'clock. So please join us for that. I again thank folks for finding us this morning. Our webinar account had a fatal error this morning. We should be back online and back to normal next week for Katie's conversation with the Reverend Sarah Berlin on Advent and finding light. It will be a great next step from this conversation with you today, Glenn. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you everyone who found us this morning and those who are watching by recording. We appreciate having you here. All
thank
Jane's
you for the
Farms.
opportunity. May you have a resilient Advent.
We had a resilient morning. So that's a good start. Thank you so much, Glenn, and we'll see everyone at church. Bye-bye.